I'm pleased to introduce this second session of our third day of the LSIW 2022. And the session is on examining key practical questions around SFDR and EU taxonomy for fund managers and investors. And this session is hosted by Linklaters. Linklaters is a multinational law firm well known in Luxembourg and with a team of multidisciplinary, highly experienced lawyers. For that, I'm pleased to welcome today Désirée Catalano, Investment Fund Associate at Linklaters since 2021. Désirée specializes her practice on regulatory aspects related to alternative investment funds, as well as retail investor funds, financial services and securities law. Martin Meger, Investment Funds Partner at Linklaters. He has specialized experience with regard to the structuring, establishment and ongoing advice on alternative investment funds, as well as advising institutional investors with regard to investments, international fund structures. Martin advised in a wide range of asset classes, including private equity, real estate, infrastructure, green energy, debt and impact. Désirée, Martin, the floor is yours.
Yes, first of all, welcome to our session this morning. Thanks for having us. And what we thought is, for fund managers, there are in essence three regulations that are of great importance. It's the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation that came into effect on 10th of March last year. The Taxonomy Regulation, the kind of EU-wide classification of what constitutes environmentally sustainable economic activities, and the Benchmark Regulation. And those three are really at the essence of what we have been advising over the past 18 months fund managers when they set up funds, when we advise funds that are ongoing, or investors when they invest in those kind of funds. And what we thought is that we give you, in half an hour, 40 minutes, a summary of what the typical questions are that we are being asked by our clients and that always come up when we advise on those topics. So it's not really about giving you a basic understanding of those regulations. It's really about what are the questions that we are faced with all the time. And we're going to do it in a bit of a conversation and just give you our thoughts on this, not too formal. We have a few slides in the back. They are detailed. They can be circulated afterwards. But it's really just about giving you an idea what are the questions. And I thought, Désirée, maybe let's start with one, because we're here at a LuxFlag conference. What is LuxFlag offers labels? A lot of the talk that we have when discussing with clients is we need a certain classification because it's a label that investors expect. So are the regulations that we are talking about, SFDR taxonomy, are these really labels, or what do we tell our clients when they come up with this idea?
Thank you for this first question. It's actually very interesting and it helps us starting off properly. SFDR is not about labeling. It's about something else. It's about disclosure. It's about investor protection and investor transparency. So, of course, we tend to qualify funds. We have to qualify funds differently based on the applicable article that we can apply, but this should not be a way of labeling our funds and solely. Hence, we should not talk about the labels, Article 6, 8 or 9. We should talk about the disclosure obligations coming from the application of one or the other article. And European Commission has been very straightforward on this. That said, it's true that even in the market, we tend to create other different labels besides Article 6, 8 or 9, such as, for example, light green, dark green. We will discuss about this also later. Yeah.
And I think if we talk about the classifications, it can give us a bit of an insight, kind of what the basic requirements are. If you look at Article 8, and we're going to talk about this for quite some while, I think there you really see that Article 8 covers a broad range of funds, which can be very, very light green and which can be very, very dark green. And it's absolutely not a good thing to compare those kind of funds and say, oh, they're both Article 8, so they're somehow the same. That just doesn't make any sense. And I think, especially in that area, you can see that it's really not a label. You might think differently about Article 9, because there the requirements are very high that you need to fulfill. But generally, I think the message is it's not a label. But we have the slide here in 2 sentences for each category. What are the requirements of being Article 6, 8, 9?
So what I always like to say is that Article 6 sets something like the minimum set of rules that have to be complied with. Article 6 funds are funds that do not take into account ESG considerations, but anyways have to provide certain disclosures, like, for example, the integration of sustainability risks and the impact that such risks may have on the financial return of our product. So this disclosure you will then find also in the different other 2 products, which are Article 8 and Article 9. Article 8 fund, as Martin said, is a catch-all category. So in here, all the funds that promote environmental and social characteristics without a specific percentage of such promotion fall into this bucket. Here we have the Article 6 requirements, so the disclosure about integration of sustainability risks and the impact that these have on the financial returns of our product, but also other obligations. And this is actually what we were saying. It is not about labeling, it is about disclosure obligation and allowing investors to properly understand how the fund takes into account ESG in their investment process. So here we have also disclosure on the ENS characteristics, on the good governance principles that have to be complied with and at the level of the investee company, and the website disclosure and reporting. These 2, the final obligations, we find them also at the Article 9 funds. What are Article 9 funds? We as said by Martin, we normally see these Article 9 funds promoted by impact managers, some people, some managers that strive for excellence in the sustainability sector. So Article 9 funds are those funds that pursue sustainable objectives. And with this, there are some obligations that come with it, which are disclosure obligations. So the managers have to set out a minimum percentage of sustainable objectives they want to pursue with their product, and they do not significant harm, as well also as the compliance with good governance practices.
So quite often we have the situation, client comes, says, yeah, well, we don't do a lot on ESG, but we really want to be Article 8. How difficult is that? Or the second scenario, we have a fund manager who does quite a bit on ESG and says, I would really like to be Article 9. So how difficult is it to be Article 8 or to be Article 9? I understand 6 is pretty easy because that's the default position if you don't really do a lot.
Yes. So it is actually not that difficult to be an Article 8. That's why we say that it's a catch-all category. Promoting environmental and social characteristics without a specific percentage, but simply bindingly commit to it, makes you fall under the Article 8 bucket. Hence, implies that you have to provide certain specific disclosures. You have to provide a website disclosure, and you have to do the reporting on such ESG data. Different story for Article 9 funds. Pursuing a sustainable objective is definitely more complicated, and also comes with a more burdensome disclosure obligation rules.
And in practice, what do we see mostly? I mean 8, yeah, covers a broad range. Article 9, rather difficult. What's the standard? What do we tell our clients? What do other fund managers do? I mean, that's quite often a question. We don't know what we want to do, but we don't want to be different to the others. So what do we see in the market?
Yeah, so this is very interesting, and I think this is the lack of having started to work already with the beginning of the ESG era. We have seen very different approaches, but a shift from 10th of March 2021 until today. At the beginning, I would say everyone was a bit scared, so everyone was tending to go more for an Article 6 fund. We had more Article 6 funds. We had with limited disclosures, because the framework, especially because the framework was still not finalized, and there was no clarity about the obligations that would result out of one or the other classification. So at the beginning we had a lot of Article 6 funds. Now I think we are at the stage where the bucket of Article 8 funds is growing and growing, and we also have several Article 9 funds.
Yes, I think really at the beginning it was how big is the legal risk not being able to comply with the requirements under SFDR? That was the question. So it was more a risk-based approach and then saying, oh, well, we rather go for Article 6 instead of 8, even though we see ourselves doing some stuff on ESG, we go the careful way and we do Article 6. And the same, a lot of real impact fund managers who do a lot on ESG still saying, we don't exactly know whether we can really comply with Article 9. We don't know whether we get all the reporting, all the information that we need. And we rather take the careful approach, go for Article 8. I think with this Article 8 or 9 question, it's still something that's normal these days. The question 6 or 8 really has changed, as you say. And I think there are mostly two reasons for it. One is that if a fund manager manages a fund and sends around a marketing presentation, investors typically expect them to say something about ESG. So if you have a marketing presentation of 80 slides, a normal presentation, there are 5 slides about ESG. If you have 5 slides on there, you will probably say, yeah, you're somehow good on this. And that constitutes promotion of environmental or social characteristics. So if you look at the marketing presentation, there is typically a promotion of environmental and social objectives. And that means you fall in the bucket Article 8. And if you want to say something positive about it, you need to be Article 8. And that really, I think there's been a discussion going on in fund managers between the legal teams on the one hand and the marketing teams on the other hand, where they ended up, okay, we need to be Article 8 in order to be able to say what we have said, what we want to say. Yeah? And so that's really the one part. The second part is the United States. There was, at the beginning, uncertainty as to whether US pension funds can still invest into funds that promote environmental or social characteristics or even have a sustainable investment objective, so are Article 8 or 9. Because under US law, the basic principle was you can only invest the money of a pension funds into assets that maximize returns. It needs to be about maximizing returns. And the question arose, can you then still invest into a fund like this? And there's been some more relaxed position on this in the United States, and so that has also allowed fund managers to go from Article 6 to 8 or from 8 to 9. And so it's really a change in what the standard approach these days is. So what we see in the market is most funds go for Article 8. Doesn't mean that you can't have an Article 6 or that you can't market it or investors will no longer buy this kind of product. But the standard approach, at least when it's about marketing to institutional investors, is probably Article 8. Article 8 is actually an interesting category, and there are a lot of specific questions, because what do you really need to do in order to be Article 8? And so one of the standard questions I think we get is always, yeah, what we do on ESG is we have certain exclusions. And is that enough to be Article 8? So there are a lot of ways how you can say that you do something good in ESG. But the standard approach that most fund managers have taken in the past, they exclude certain investments that are bad from an ESG perspective. And the question is that enough for Article 8?
It can be enough. We have a lot of Article 8 funds which are based on an exclusion-only approach. However, what we always try to tell our client, we try to understand with our clients, is if those exclusions are actually having an impact on the investment universe that they are selecting, or if they are strict and broad enough to actually lower the percentage of the portfolio companies that fall into their investment universe or not. principally, for example, applying exclusions, basic exclusions such as controversial weapons or pornography or tobacco would be probably not considered enough. So a case-by-case analysis is necessary and a prudent approach, but obviously possible. Also, additionally, if we add with the negative screening to the negative screening a positive screening, this obviously provides us with a more robust justification of the Article 8 qualification.
Yes, and I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens here when we have a brown taxonomy. You might know that currently we have the EU taxonomy that defines what's green. There's going to be a social taxonomy, what is social, and there's going to be a brown taxonomy, and that's, those are the kind of assets that you shouldn't invest into, they are bad. And I think the categorization that we will then have in the future more accurately describes what you need to be, what you need to do for Article 8 or 9, because you need to do something good, you need to be somehow green. It's not enough to exclude brown assets, you need to somehow do something good. And I think that categorization, currently we have green and non-green, in the future we'll have green, neutral and brown, and it's not enough to exclude brown, you need to do something good for ESG. And I think then it's clearer, and what we try to advise our clients is that they should not only rely on exclusions unless the exclusions are pretty strict, so that you can actually know that you are somehow in the green area. But if you can also define something positive that you actually want to pursue with the fund. And that's a lot more robust if you want to be Article 8 than just relying on exclusions, even though it's a quite standard approach that is still taken in the market. So here, that's actually a slide where you can see different strategies how to deal with ESG. Just as a background, we're talking about the top left-hand corner, the exclusions. The slide before said there's 6, 8, and 9. There's one more category that there's a lot of talk about, that's 8+. And if you read the regulation, if you read the SFDR, you will not find anything on 8+. What's 8+?
So 8+ is a merge between Article 6 and Article 9 funds. What is this? It's the attempt to bridge the gap between the two funds. So what we discussed before is that Article 6 fund are funds that do not have ESG considerations, do not take into consideration ESG aspects. Article 8 funds are those that promote environmental and social characteristics. Article 9 funds are those that pursue a sustainable objective as defined under SFDR, which might be environmental or social. So what is Article 8+? Article 8+ is a mix between the two. So as you may see in the slide here, we have a fund which promotes environmental and social characteristics, but it also pursues a sustainable objective for a minimum percentage, which is a binding commitment, but it is done. So this is the difference between Article 8 and 9. We have both aspects into one fund. What does this entail? This entails that specific obligations that are typical of Article 9 funds also apply to our Article 8 fund for that commitment, binding commitment to pursue sustainable objective. Hence, we will have a do not significant harm disclosure and the obligation to bindingly commit to it.
And why is it interesting for fund managers to go for 8+? So if I hear you right, 8+ means you need to do more. You need to explain if you have a certain percentage of sustainable investments. You need to disclose that. You need to have your website accordingly. You need to, in your periodic disclosure, you need to kind of show that that percentage is actually met. So you need to show that these investments are sustainable, which is a high burden, positive contribution, in particular the do not significant harm principle. I mean, that's in practice, by the way, one of the main differences between 8 funds that are pretty good on ESG and 9 funds. 9 means you need to comply with the do not significant harm principle. Quite often in practice it's quite easy to show that you make a positive contribution to an environmental or social objective, but it's a lot more difficult to show that you don't do anything bad for the other objectives. So the do not significant harm principle is quite a big of a burden. And the question is, why should a fund manager then say, yeah, well, I can't get the Article 9 label anyway. I'm 8. Why should I go for 8+? What does it give me?
So there might be different reasons for this. I would say the first thing that comes into my mind is prudent approach. you would like to have an Article 9 fund, you would like to have a 90 to 100% of sustainable investments into your bucket, into your portfolio, but then you rather be prudent and take a cautious approach and go gradually. So improving, enhancing your disclosures, enhancing your investment processes, internal investment processes, but slowly. Other reason could be that it's actually attractive for your investors. You want to probably taste the appetite of the investor, seeing if the product as also pursuing sustainable objective is interesting for the market or not. And other interesting point might be MiFID. So the latest recent changes into the MiFID regime, which obliges to ask for the client's sustainability preferences, where there is also a specific question asking the investor, do you want to have sustainable investments? Do you want to have principal adverse impacts observed by your fund in which you are investing in? Well, if you have an Article 8 plus fund, then this product might be advised to those clients too.
And I think therefore in practice it's a category that we do see quite often. So that's not to be underestimated, but be aware that if you want to read something about 8 plus, there's no point in looking into the regulation because there's really, it's not explicitly mentioned. Probably the standard question, or the question that is being asked most often in my experience is, what percentage of sustainable investments do you need to have in your fund in order to qualify for Article 9? What's the answer on that?
So Article 9 is easy. Article 9 is a very high percentage.
I guess it's easy to answer. The requirement is actually pretty high.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it brings us back to what you said before. That's why we think of Article 9 more like a label, because it's so difficult, it's more difficult to pursue that percentage of sustainable investments. Why are we saying this? Because we normally see Article 9 funds as those funds that have 90 to 100% of their investments into sustainable objectives, investments, sorry. So this is, and it's a binding commitment, and it has to be disclosed, especially in the, as I guess most of us know, the RTS annexes that now have to be added into our prospectuses. So, yeah, this is what the European Commission also already actually said. It said that almost all investments should be qualifiable as sustainable investments. However, there is one exception. That is liquidity holds, for example, by the funds that cannot be considered as sustainable investments, but have to be held into the fund because, well, for regulatory obligations also, and for the proper functioning of the fund.
Yes, I think that's important to note that of course there are certain assets in the fund, or there will always be certain assets in the fund that can't themselves be sustainable. But if they are kind of a means to achieve the purpose, the good purpose, then that's of course allowed. And cash is a good example, because in a fund you need to hold cash. I mean, there's at least, before you make an investment, a logical second that you need to have the cash in the fund. In an open-ended fund, you need to have a lot of cash in order to fulfill redemption requests. So there needs to be cash in the fund, and for those investments, they themselves don't need to be good on environmental or social characteristics. They can be neutral in the end, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. So that's 9. So in essence, we're saying almost all your investments need to be sustainable. You can't have a large part in there. To be honest, I think at the beginning, before we didn't have the preamble of the RTS, we advised should be at least 50%, because it was the only guidance you have in the regulation is you need to have a sustainable investment objective. Yeah, what does it mean? And then we thought, okay, more than 50% should be enough. But the preamble of the RTS seems a lot more strict. Even though there's no binding statement in the regulation itself, the preamble makes everyone assume that it needs to be something 90-100%, excluding cash. So it's pretty strict, even though the answer is easy to give, because we have something that we can rely on. A different question is, what about Article 8? Is there a minimum requirement on assets that promote environmental or social characteristics?
So for straightforward Article 8 funds, there is no minimum percentage. However, there has to be a binding commitment to promote those ENS characteristics. Different story is for Article 8 plus funds, where we actually have a minimum percentage of sustainable objective that has to be disclosed into our annexes.
And I think the 8 is quite interesting. The question doesn't come too often, but we had, for example, one client who came to us and said, yeah, we're managing this real estate fund. We don't want to be good on ESG. We want to be Article 6. That's all. Investors are fine with it. It's sufficient. We don't want to have website disclosures. We don't want to do periodic reporting on ESG. But we already know certain assets that will be in the fund. And we know that one real estate project is going to be very good on ESG. It's actually a sustainable investment, probably. Even though we know that, and in the prospectus of the fund, this asset is mentioned, and it's mentioned that it's got those very good ESG performance. Can we still say we are Article 6? And the answer is probably no, because there is no minimum percentage. And if you put in your prospectus something that says, yeah, 15% of the fund portfolio, that's this one asset, is actually going to be green, you promote environmental and social characteristics, even though you possibly don't want that. And that means you're automatically Article 8. And your attempt to say you're Article 6 could be considered as whitewashing. I mean, whenever we talk about SFDR, it's always about greenwashing. Yeah? SFDR aims at preventing greenwashing. But here it's the question, can the manager wash himself white? Yeah? And that's a bit of an uncommon topic, but it's actually relevant, and we've had this in the past. So it's, but the short message is for 8, there is simply no minimum percentage. We'll probably say if it's, I don't know, 2-3%, you can argue, yeah, that's not relevant. But already with 10, 15, we didn't feel comfortable to say you can be Article 6. So that's just, I think, an example that is not being talked about too often, but which is relevant. We talked about liquidity. What do you need to respect if you're an Article 9 fund and you hold liquidity? Is this something can you just say it's neutral, or do you need to consider something?
So normally you should consider minimum safeguards. Different aspect is about cash, right?
That's kind of the question. If you can find a large bank with a good rating that hasn't had a scandal somewhere in the world in the past, may be difficult to find that. So I think the minimum safeguards on putting cash in a bank account shouldn't be too burdensome, maybe different if you hold liquidity investments in the form of money market funds or more like an investment type asset, yeah? Then it's a different story. But that's also a big discussion going on. What do I need to take care of with respect to cash in the fund or other liquid investments that I'm doing? Another question I think that we always see is, and we already mentioned that at the beginning, can you upgrade or downgrade? So we said at the beginning there were funds that were 6, and then later they thought, oh, well, we should be 8, and there were 8 funds or 8 plus that thought, well, maybe we upgrade at a later point in time. Can we do that?
Back to the trend that we saw, sort of shifting. Actually, yes, upgrades, common, especially in the latest days. Having to include further disclosures have somehow pushed clients to also think of upgrading their products. Downgrades may be less common and a bit more difficult. What is an upgrade? Normally we see upgrades from Article 6 to Article 8, I would say, mostly, not exclusively, and from Article 8 to Article 8 plus. This means that the client is accepting that he will have to provide further disclosures, but what is the reason why they decide to upgrade? Well, first of all, I think investor appetite, it's always that. But then not only, they get more data with time, they are able to gather more data, and they analyze differently their investment processes, the portfolio, and they end up understanding that probably they may be able to qualify as an Article 8. Also because we said Article 8 is a very broad category, so by further analysis they might end up deciding that an upgrade is is necessary. So this is very common, and we have seen that and is accepted, although it entails an amendment of the investment strategy. Different topic, the downgrades. These are more recent, fewer, less common, I would say, and also, especially for regulated products, a bit more difficult to achieve, because this raises a lot of questions by CSSF. However, it's possible, it just has to be justified. What are the reasons why we normally might be downgrading from Article 8 plus to Article 8, for example, or from Article 9 to 8. More from Article 8 plus to 8. Why? This is something interesting we saw with some of the clients. They realized that they had in their fund range, they had two products which were very similar. So they had a lot of Article 8 plus and Article 9 funds. What is the difference between Article 8 plus and 9 funds? We have already said, but what is the thing that they have in common is the sustainable objective. So at the end, our clients realized that they had probably two similar products in their fund range, which was not really encountering the investor appetite, meaning that investors were a bit confused or would rather go for an full Article 9 fund or Article 8 fund. So this is, for example, one of the reasons why they decided to downgrade.
And I mean, the legal consequences of that need to be considered. Do you need to give investors a free exit right and questions like that? So it's very in practice very difficult to achieve that because you're kind of changing the investment strategy of the fund in the end, unless you've sold a different one at the beginning to the investors, and the consequences can be severe. So it needs to be properly analyzed whether it's at all feasible and there are reasons that are sufficiently narrow in order to achieve the goal. Probably my final question on SFDR, one that we get frequently, is the question on names. So there are a lot of fund managers coming with, we call our fund sustainable, blah, 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 but we want to be Article 8. Is that okay, even though a sustainable investment objective is only given under Article 9? Or we want to call our fund, or want to put into the fund name some reference to ESG. Can we do that even though we're only Article 6? So what are the guidelines there?
So there is no real name convention under SFDR. However, there has been some guidance from ESMA, and what we normally recommend is to use the term sustainable, green, only for impact, only for Article 8, 8 plus, or 9. Or 8 plus or 9 or Article 8 funds which are taxonomy aligned. This is our probably house view.
When talking about sustainable, the question is always what does sustainable means? And with that question, we kind of move from the SFDR to the taxonomy, because the taxonomy, as mentioned at the beginning, it's the EU definition of what constitutes sustainable with respect to EU, with respect to the environment. But the term sustainable is both used in the SFDR and the taxonomy. Is it the same? Is it understood to be the same, or are there differences?
No, sorry, taking the right slide. So SFDR and taxonomy are similar in some ways, but different in others. And as introduced by Martin, the term of sustainability is actually different of sustainable investment. Why is that? Because taxonomy only refers to environmental objectives. So while the SFDR definition of sustainable objective refers to the environmental objectives, but also to the social objectives. So the main difference between these two frameworks is that taxonomy is not yet looking at the social aspects, but is only looking at specific environmental objectives, which are, for example, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and so on. So this is one of the main differences between the two. Another aspect is the fact that taxonomy regulation looks at the economic activity of the underlying investments, while SFDR relates to the investee company level.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing is that the taxonomy is kind of narrower than the SFDR. SFDR, I mean, the definitions are pretty similar, because you need to contribute positively to an ERS characteristic. You need to, the do not significant harm principle needs to be observed. But indeed, the E is narrower because SFDR also takes into account social. And then there are the technical screening criteria. That's the fourth requirement for under the taxonomy to be sustainable. So those are really, this is really where to look if you want to know specifically whether a certain activity is considered to be sustainable. And there are on hundreds and hundreds of pages, there's described what can be considered sustainable and not. I think in the press, you in recent months, there was mostly the discussion about nuclear and gas. Can that be considered sustainable under the taxonomy? So there is a lot of very specific information, very specific requirements that you need to adhere to. There are a lot of activities that are not actually covered by the taxonomy, so that you may have an activity that is very, very green, but because it's just not mentioned in those technical screening criteria, you are not considered as taxonomy aligned. You are not considered green within the meaning of the EU taxonomy. And so it's the taxonomy is narrow, and that's why in practice, when we are asked, is this sustainable under the SFDR, we kind of first look to the taxonomy, try to see, is that activity already mentioned there? For example, we're doing wind parks or solar power plants. Okay, that's pretty easy. We can say, yeah, that's sustainable under the EU taxonomy, so it should also be sustainable within the meaning of the SFDR. But be careful. The definition is not exclusively narrow. There's also one aspect to consider where actually the SFDR is narrower than the taxonomy, and that's the do not significant harm principle. Because the do not significant harm principle under the taxonomy only looks at E. So you need to positively contribute to one of the green objectives, and you cannot harm or substantially harm any of the other 5 green objectives under the taxonomy. So that's only looking at E. For the SFDR, with respect to the do not significant harm principle, you also need to look at social. So you also need to show that you do not harm any social objectives. And so there, the SFDR is actually narrow or requires something in addition. So you can't simply say that if you're taxonomy compliant, that asset will also always be considered sustainable within the meaning of the SFDR. So to a certain extent, the taxonomy is narrower. To another extent, the SFDR is narrow, and that needs to be considered. So it's quite the interplay between the two regimes can be quite difficult, and that's important to remember. So under SFDR, you're obliged to disclose to what extent you invest taxonomy aligned. What do we see in practice? What are percentages that you see?
So there is a broad variety. As with SFDR, we have different products. Also, with the taxonomy alignment, we see different approaches. I would say also here there has been a shift, and probably the tendency is also linked to the fact that the taxonomy is still a bit work in process. So what we see for now is many not taxonomy aligned products, 0% disclosures, but not only. We also have some products that are disclosing some percentages of taxonomy alignment because for them it's, for example, easier to assess whether there is a taxonomy aligned or not. And here we reconnect to what Martin just explained. There is one part of this exercise that you have to do when you take the taxonomy and you take out these technical screening criteria, which are something like 200 pages of pretty much technical stuff in there, and you have to understand whether your economic activity falls in there or not. This might be easier for some sectors, for some specific types of funds and investment strategies. It might be a bit more difficult for others. So, for example, in real estate, we find a bit higher percentage of taxonomy alignment, and also in green energy funds there, we have higher percentage of taxonomy alignment. So we see a bit of everything, let's say.
Yeah, I think indeed green energy, that's pretty easy to show that you're taxonomy compliant. Yeah, you know the technologies that you're talking about, and typically they are reflected in the technical screening criteria, and you can say whether that's green or not. Real estate, I think there the reason is probably mostly because quite often those funds know what they're going to invest into. And the criteria under which you can be sustainable are pretty clear for real estate, and you know what kind of assets you're looking for. A lot more difficult for private equity, for example. Yeah, if you have a broad private equity investment strategy focusing on a lot of different sectors, you just simply don't know what could be an interesting target. And there it's a lot more difficult to say right from the start, yes, we're going to have 50% taxonomy compliant assets. So I think there the percentages are very low. Quite often you have 0% in there, even for Article 9 funds, because you don't know whether you have you're going to have assets that are sustainable within the meaning of the taxonomy. So very, very careful approach, I think, usually taken unless you're absolutely sure that you're limited to certain technologies that clearly fall within the scope of the taxonomy. I think there we are, aren't we? That was kind of a short ride through some of the questions that we are being asked. I don't know whether there are additional questions in the audience. If there are, we're happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you, Désirée. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Merci, vielen Dank. The question is around the cash. So what I'm not quite clear in your also explanation, the Article 9, because the cash sits on the accounts, and whatever it's doing, you are going to invest into the investments. No? So it's going to go into the investments, so it could not be used for anything else. So, and I'm still not clear, are we including cash as a sustainable investment if it sits under the Article 9 product or not? No. The same goes to the hedging instrument, where you have interest rate hedges for whatever, or sometimes also the foreign currency hedges. Do you include this as well? Because they are related to investments too, so they are not like fully.
The answer is no. So you don't include them in the sustainable investments. How do you want to show that bank sitting on a cash sitting on a bank account is somehow sustainable? It's just a means to achieve indirectly the purpose, because you need to do it to later on invest into to make the actual investments. So when talking about sustainable investments, you only talk about the actual investments that you are doing later on. So the cash typically is not, and the cash investments are typically not regarded as sustainable. There might be certain cases. So we've had a fund manager who actually was thinking about cash quite a bit, and whether he can look for certain liquidity investments that are actually considered green. Yeah? But that's the rare exception. Generally, the common approach is no. Both liquidity investments and hedging instruments, they're neutral. And what you need to do is, you need to make sure that minimum safeguards are applied. I don't know, some banks in states where you shouldn't invest, probably not appropriate to put the money on. But apart from that, it's neutral in the end.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very clear. My name is Nasser. I'm from FactSet. I have a question regarding the implementation of the regulation. In your experience, what do you see are the key struggles during the implementation phase? I was curious about that.
You mean within the organizations?
Yeah.
There are a lot. And the first question is probably, where do you start and what do you have? Because you don't want to change everything just because you want to comply with the regulation. So the question is, what do you have already with respect to procedures regarding the investment strategy? So a lot of, when we started for funds doing the Article 6 disclosures, we basically tried to collect what do you do within the organization? To what extent are ESG considerations already relevant in your investment processes? And what can you do if you don't think that's sufficient so far? So that's where you start. You start with what do you have? And then the question is, what do you want to achieve? And bridging that gap, I think a lot of fund managers have invested a lot in ESG teams. It's about collection of information. I think that's one of the very important things, because you need to be able to report if fund managers invest in developing countries. Will you be at all in a position to provide the information that you need to fulfill in order to have a proper periodic disclosure? Those are the kind of questions, but it can be a lot. At the same time, some fund managers already had at the time very good processes in place. For them, it was easier. But it can be a lot, can be less, depending on what you have and what you want to achieve. Sorry, very abstract question, I know.
Any other question?
So thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. And I have one additional question. It would be like, can you, if you want to upgrade your fund, can you go from Article 8 to Article 9 without passing through 8+? And is it only a matter of disclosure? For example, if at a certain point you get a better data, so you can say, okay, now I have a better data on my investee companies. And so can you just become from one day to another an Article 9? Or do you need, does it require real portfolio change from the asset manager?
It's a good question. I think both is possible.
Yeah, definitely. I think both is possible. What we have seen is actually both approaches, either going from Article 8 to 8+, and then from 8+ to 9, because it's it's not only about disclosures, as Martin just explained before. It's about data gathering, first of all, which is one of the causes why our fund managers decide to upgrade or downgrade their products at one point, because they understand that they either not have enough data, or they're now having more data, but not only more data, also qualitative better data. So both approaches are actually possible. Either you go from 8 to 8+ and then 8+9, or straight from an 8 to a 9, but there obviously the justifications have to be a bit more robust. And the thing is that it's not only about disclosures, it's also about your internal processes. So you have to disclose what actually is done internally at fund manager level or investment manager level.
And if I interpret your question right, there's a second part to it. There are two different situations where you can upgrade. One is, as you mentioned, you suddenly don't change anything. You still invested in the same assets. Yeah, you just suddenly get the information that you need under 9, and then it's pretty easy to upgrade because it doesn't come with a change in the investment strategy. You're still doing the same. You've done it always like this, but suddenly you have the data to fulfill the requirements under Article 9, and then you do it. So that's a lot easier to achieve. A different question is if you want to upgrade by changing your investment strategy. So if you suddenly say, I always thought that I was going to have 30% sustainable investments, and now you say everything is going to be sustainable. That's a change in investment strategy. And the prerequisites under which you're allowed to change your investment strategy are, of course, a lot higher than just having than the others in the other scenario where you don't change anything. You just suddenly have the information. So the two situations are indeed very different, and you need to look at what you need to do to achieve the upgrade. I think that's also very important.
Thank you. I think we just have time to answer some questions from the chat. So, first question from the chat, sorry. How would fund managers argue the reclassification from Article 8 or 9 products to Article 6 products with regards to their investor who were expecting ESG outcomes from their investments?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear. That's a difficult decision to make because you disclosed to investors you were going to be 8 or 9, and now you say, no, you're not. So you're not doing what you promised to do. So that's an issue. And if you want to do that, you'll in a regulated fund at least, CSSF clearly says if you're changing that investment strategy, you need to give the investors a free exit right. And so it comes at a high cost to do that. So that again shows you need to be careful in classifying your funds. So if you're not sure that you can fulfill the obligations, rather start with a lower category. It's the safer approach because the legal consequences can be severe.
Thank you. Second question, could we invest in derivatives for Article 9 or 8 funds, excluding hedging purposes? Do you consider them as sustainable investment?
Yes, the problem is then you will need to do a look-through probably, because how do you show with a derivative that you're pursuing a sustainable investment objective or that you're promoting certain E&S characteristics? The derivative itself is nothing. I mean, that's just a piece of paper. But the question is, what does the derivative refer to? So what does it, the performance of the derivative, what does it depend on? And those are the actual assets, and they then need to be good on E&S characteristics or be sustainable, whatever it is. So you need to do a look through the derivative, and that's a challenge to adhere to.
Thank you. Any other questions? I would like to thank you, Désirée, Martin. That was an excellent presentation, clear view from your practice, and thanks also to Linklaters for hosting the session. I think it was very useful for everyone.
Thank you very much.
Our next session will start at 11, hosted by FactSet and focusing on artificial intelligence in ESG, why, where, and when. See you soon.